Great, thanks, Julio. And next up, we'll have Jessica Gagete Miranda. I will pull up her slides. Jessica Gagete Miranda, who is a research fellow in the Department of Economics Management and Statistics at the University of Milano Bicocca.
Hi, hello. So first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to present my work here. I'm very excited to be here today. And in this, maybe I'll just put this here. So in this work, what I do is basically look at how friends from school influence one another in their schooling decisions in the future. So basically, how they're going, in my case here, how they're going to influence high school completion of their friends. And I'll do that in the context of Brazil. And I'm also going to investigate how aspirations play an important role in such an influence. So just to start with some motivation, we have like this large body of literature in peer effects, usually looking at students' achievement or performance. And we have some mixed results on these studies, right? Sometimes they find very important peer effects. Sometimes they find absent peer effects, and it looks like it's very context dependent. A more recent stream of this literature has looked at peers' influence or friends' influence on human capital investment decisions. And this literature has found more robust results, let's say. They are larger, usually, than these peer effects in achievement or performance. And they don't look like they're context dependent. But one thing that still we need to understand more is what are the mechanisms behind such an important influence that peers have on human capital accumulation. And I think it's important to disentangle those mechanisms if we want to understand whether it's possible to implement some policy, for instance, in order to leverage this influence. So what I do in this work is to look at peer effects on students' high school completion. The main idea here is that I'm going to ask how my friends' likelihood to finish high school will influence my own likelihood to finish high school. As I said, I'll do that in the context of Brazil, where we still have kind of low high school completion rates. Then I'm going to look at the mechanisms behind such an impact, and especially in the role that aspirations plays into that. To do that, I'm going to exploit some social network data collected in middle schools, public middle schools in the state of São Paulo, in Brazil. And I'm going to acknowledge some problems that emerge when we try to estimate peer effects and implement a methodology that tries to deal with those problems. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. So the data that I use here comes from this survey that was answered by students in the 9th grade of those public middle schools, and this survey was answered in 2011. Just one observation here is that the 9th grade is the last grade of middle schools in Brazil, so it's a bit different than the context here in the US. And this survey was basically a very comprehensive questionnaire about students' profile, how happy or satisfied they were with their lives, and their study habits, and also their expectations and aspirations towards the future. I'm going to talk a little bit more about each question of the survey that I'm going to exploit when I discuss the mechanisms. But for now, let me just tell you that I also have information on students' friendship ties in the 9th grade. So each student were asked to name their 4 best friends or colleagues. And I'm able to map these in order to find the ties of like the friendship network of these students for each school. And then I'm also able to merge the survey with administrative data and to recover, for instance, information on whether those students end up completing high school or not. Okay, so the identification of peer effects here. I wish I had like an experiment to show you here. I don't. I had to rely in a kind of heavy methodology, and I'll have to spare some minutes discussing that. Otherwise, you'll just have to trust me that I'm finding causal impacts here. I hope I don't bore you so much with that. I'll try to be fast. So let's start with this model of friendship influence, where my own outcomes will depend on the average outcomes of my friends, on my own characteristics and on the average characteristics of my friends. And here in this second equation, the only thing that I'm doing is kind of translating this first equation into matrix notation. I'm introducing this matrix G. Here, each element ij of this matrix will take value equal 1 if a student I sends a friendship tie to student J and 0 otherwise. If you're not familiar with social network analysis notation, that's not a problem. The only thing you have to know in order to follow the next slides is that if G maps the friends that I have, G square will map the friends of my friends, G to the third level will map the friends of friends of friends, so on and so forth. So every time I'm talking about G, I'm talking about the student's friends. If I'm talking about G square, I'm talking about the friends of this student. So there's some challenge when we try to estimate this equation here. And the first one is that all peers or friends are embedded in a same environment and subject to common shocks. So for instance, they could have a very inspiring teacher that would encourage them to finish high school, but this does not necessarily mean that they are influencing one another to finish high school, right? Then even within a same environment, students do not have the same impact on each other, right? Because we have endogenous formation of peer groups or endogenous formation of friendship. I think everybody here has the sense that we do not just pick our friends at random. There are very specific reasons why we choose our friends. And homophily, which is this characteristic that people have to click with similar others. So homophily is a very important driver of friendship formation. I have just one example here. This is a graph coming from one of the schools that I'm analyzing. And we see that orange dots are girls and gray dots are boys. And it's very easy to see how girls are much more likely to be associated with other girls and boys are much more likely to be associated with other boys. So this is just one example of how homophily is important in determining friendship. Finally, we have the reflection problem. So I influence my friends will influence me back at the same time. How can we disentangle exactly who's influencing whom in this situation? Now, to solve or to address those challenges, as I said, I implement a quite long methodology. I'll do my best to be clear in these few minutes that I have. But if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer in the Q&A. Okay, so to address the common shocks or common environment that everyone is embedded in, this is the most straightforward thing to address. I'm just going to control for classroom fixed effects in my estimations. Then the endogenous formation of friendship. What I do here is to first model the likelihood that any two students in the school will become friends based on some very exogenous characteristics of those students. So for instance, their gender or their race. And also I include in this model a dummy variable that is equal 1 if they share their first name initials. So the first name initial of those students is a very important predictor of friendship formation because when they arrived in school in 6th grade, they were allocated into alphabetical order. So they have like this random chance to get to know each other just because they share their first name initial. So then I model like the likelihood that two students will become friends given those exogenous variables. Now let me put this model aside for just 1 second while I'll tell you how I go about addressing the reflection problem, and I'm going to bring it back in a minute. So the reflection problem, again, I influence my friends influence me back, how we disentangle who is influencing whom. I'm going to borrow from the works of Bramoulet and co-authors and Di Giorgi and co-authors, and I'm going to exploit the fact that not everybody is connected to everybody else in the network, and I'm going to use friends of friends characteristics as instrumental variables for friends outcomes. So if we look at this toy model, maybe it's easier to understand what I'm doing. We have that, for instance, Lisa is connected to Anna, and Anna is connected to Tina, but Lisa and Tina are not connected. In this case, Lisa will influence Tina only through the influence that she has on Anna, right? So I'm able to use Lisa's characteristics to kind of move the likelihood that Anna has to finish high school, and as such, to disentangle the impact that Anna has to finish high school on the impact that Tina has to finish high school. That's the main idea here. And everything would be settled if we did not have endogenous formation of friendship, but we do. So there might be a very specific reason why Lisa is friends with Anna, but it's not friend with Tina. In this case, my own instruments would be endogenous, and that's when I bring back my model of friendship formation. I take the predicted links coming from this model, and now instead of using the friends of friends characteristics as instrumental variables, what I do is to use the predicted friends of friends characteristics as instrumental variables. So basically, I'm cleaning my instruments to take as an instrument the friends of friends who were predicted to be friends just because of those very exogenous characteristics. So okay, that's it for the methodology. I hope I was clear. If not, I'm happy to take questions. But so now let's go to the results. These are my main results coming from this estimation. The dependent variable here is a dummy variable that indicates whether a student finished high school or not. And here we have the average of the friends of these students who finish high school. So the way to read this coefficient here is that if a student goes from having 0 of their friends to having all of their friends finishing high school, the likelihood of this student to also finish high school increases in 18.3 percentage points. On average, students named 2 friends, so we would have to divide this coefficient by 2 to get the impact of an extra friend finishing high school. This would give us 9-something percentage points, would translate into 14% increase in the likelihood that this student will finish high school. So quite important result here. And then what I do next is to look at some heterogeneous exercises. So I'm basically interacting this variable here with each variable in the column here. And while we see that friends influence, it's kind of the same for both girls and boys. We have that black students seem to be more influenced by their friends, and also the students whose mother have less than high school. They're also the ones that are being, the influence of their friends is very important for them. So this is interesting, right? It tells us that more vulnerable students, perhaps the ones that do not have the support of their family, are the ones relying more on their friends in order to make those schooling decisions. Now, I do an investigation of the mechanisms. And to do that, the first thing that I do is to bring back some questions that those students had to answer in that survey. And I use the same methodology as before, but now I'm looking at how some other variables or other characteristics of those students are spreading in their network. So, for instance, in this first column, I look at college aspirations, so basically whether students said that they would like to have a college degree or not. And what I do here is to see how my friend's college aspiration influenced my own college aspiration. Then I also do the same for perception about college returns. This is the likelihood that students attribute for them to find a job if they finish college. Again, I'm looking at how my friend's perception about college returns influence my own perception about college returns, basically looking whether they are sharing information about those returns. Fear of nerd stigma, basically whether they would like to study more, but they don't do it because they're afraid that their friends or their colleagues will think they're nerd. Peer pressure to get a job and start earning their own money. Whether they study at least 30 minutes per day outside of school hours, and also reading and math proficiency, right? So every time, each coefficient here will show how my friend's characteristics is influencing my own characteristics. And we see here that college aspirations seem to be spreading in students' networks. So if my friends want to go to college, I also want to go to college. This kind of gets on me. It does not look like they're sharing information about college return. And some other interesting results that we have here is that if my friends feel that they should start working and get a job and earning their own money, I also feel this way. If my friends study more, I also study more. But this does not translate into peer effects on proficiency for those students. Here, this coefficient is significant, but I just wanted to say that the instruments are quite small, so I really cannot say anything about this. Okay, then what I do next is to look at, I bring back the estimations of how my friend's high school completion influenced my own high school completion. This is the benchmark model that I just showed to you. And now what I'm going to do is to control for these other variables that I just showed to you, because they are important variables perhaps in determining high school completion, right? So what I'm gonna see is whether including those variables change the coefficient here. So basically investigating whether they are explaining the variation of this coefficient. Here I'm including everything but college aspirations, and we see that the coefficient is quite stable. So including those variables do not change the impact that my friends finishing high school have on my own likelihood to finish high school. However, when I control for aspirations, this coefficient goes to 0 and it's lost its significance. So apparently, friends or my aspirations and my friends' aspirations seem to be important drivers of this impact that my friends finishing high school have on my own likelihood to finish high school. So there might be important mechanisms behind that. Here I'm just controlling for everything but aspiration, and here everything and aspiration, and we have some similar patterns. The last thing that I do, if I have some time, is to use the same methodology again that I'm using before, but now instead of looking how my friends' likelihood to finish college influence my own likelihood to finish college, I'm looking at how my friends' college aspiration influence my likelihood to finish college to see whether there is a direct impact on my high school completion. And it does look like I have this important impact. And again, this is more relevant for more vulnerable students. So again, we have this interesting result here. So I think that's it. I'm gonna stop talking because I'm out of time, but thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions now.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I had a question just about the empirical strategy and like the ability to infer causal effects. So for the reflection problem, the idea that I influence you and you influence me, and the example you had with like Tina and two other people, I guess I didn't see how that solved the reflection problem, because it would still be that Lisa can influence Tina through, is it Anna? And vice versa, right? So it's still the case that if Tina convinces Anna that it's cool to stay in school, and then, you see what I'm saying? It doesn't seem like it solves the reflection problem.
Yeah, so basically what I'm doing here is to looking at exogenous friends' characteristics. So basically whether I'm a girl, whether my friends, whether my parents went to like the schooling of my parents. So some exogenous characteristics, but their outcomes. So I'm excluding the outcomes here. I'm just looking at the characteristics of my friends and whether this has an influence on my own outcomes. So if we go back, we have it here. So what I'm looking is on, for instance, Lisa, I'm looking at these characteristics of Lisa and how they are gonna move Anna's outcomes, but without considering Lisa's outcomes. So that's the main idea here, and how I can break this reflection problem. So basically, I'm taking Lisa's exogenous characteristics and see how they shift Anna's likelihood to finish high school, and then how this will, in the end of the day, impact Tina's likelihood of finish high school. That's more or less the idea. I don't know if that's clear.
I see. And just related to that, for the first one, the endogenous formation of peer group, the alphabetical order thing seems quite clever. Like it seems really nice, but it seems like you're doing that plus other things, which might be a little bit harder to interpret. I was wondering if the instrument survives if you only used the alphabetical order and don't include things like race or gender, or, other things like that.
I tried several specifications of these, and the results are pretty stable, including one specification where I only have the alphabetical order of their names.
That's great.
Hi, thanks for this very interesting talk. I have one question about how you define friends. So is it one person you're friends with, or can you name like any amount, and then if you can name multiple people, do you have in your data set how close friends they are and whether close friends kind of influence each other more than others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So each student could name at most 4 friends. So here I'm considering that they all have like the same weight in the friendship because it's just 4 friends. And actually I should say that the fact that they could name only 4 friends might be problematic because maybe they have like a 5th or 6th friend that they would like to name, and I don't see that. One thing that I do to deal with this problem is to do the same exercise, but only in the subsample of students who have named at most 3 friends. So I can see whether the results change too much regarding that, and fortunately they don't.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I think we're going to move it on to the next speaker, but keep your questions for the bigger discussion. Thank you.